I want you to picture something with me. Picture a woman standing on the front step of her own home. Not a stranger's home, not a rented flat, not somewhere she stumbled to by accident after a long night. Her home, the home she'd lived in for 31 years. The home where she'd raised her roses from bare root cuttings, where she'd watched the silver birch in the front garden grow from a sapling she and her husband had planted on their 25th wedding anniversary, where every room smelled of beeswax polish and old books, and the particular warmth that only a truly lived-in house ever carries. Picture her standing there in the November rain with her key in her hand. And the key she had used every single day for 31 years will not turn. The lock has been changed. I am that woman. My name is Margaret Sterling. I am 72 years old. I was born in Richmond, London in 1954, the daughter of a landscape architect and a music teacher who believed with great conviction that a well-tended garden was evidence of a well-tended soul. I was married for 45 years to the most extraordinary man I have ever known. I had a career I was proud of, a home I loved to my bones, and a life I had built, not inherited. Not stumbled into, built, with my own 2 hands and my husband's beside mine. And in the space of one night, one single catastrophic night, I lost all of it. Before I tell you how, I want to ask you something. If you believe that justice should always prevail, that the law should protect the vulnerable, not abandon them, please hit the hype button right now. It takes 1 second, but it tells the algorithm that this story matters. And this story does matter. Because what happened to me is happening to women all across Britain and America right now. And most of them don't even know it yet. Hit that button and then settle in, because I need to tell you everything. I should tell you about Arthur first. You cannot understand what I lost without first understanding what I had. Arthur Frederick Sterling came into my life in the summer of 1977, on a bright July afternoon that smelled of cut grass and warm stone. I was 23 years old, newly qualified, and working as a junior garden designer for my father's firm. We had been commissioned to restore the grounds of a Georgian manor house in Wiltshire, a sprawling estate with a walled kitchen garden, a formal parterre, and at the far end of the south lawn, an ancient stone sundial that had been lying on its side in the weeds for God only knew how many decades. The owners wanted it restored. They called a horological specialist. And that specialist, lean, dark-haired with grease on his shirt cuffs and a magnifying loupe tucked behind his ear like a scholar's pen, was Arthur Sterling. I watched him approach the fallen sundial the way a doctor approaches a patient. He crouched down beside it, ran his fingers along the carved gnomon, tilted his head, and said something so quiet I couldn't hear it. I thought he was talking to me. He wasn't. He was talking to the sundial. I knew right then and there that I was done for. We were married in 1979. A small ceremony in a Kensington church, with my mother's roses in the buttonholes and Arthur's father weeping so hard in the front pew that the vicar had to pause twice. We honeymooned in Florence, where Arthur spent 3 unashamed hours in a museum studying a 17th century astronomical clock, while I sat nearby drinking Chianti and feeling, for the first and most absolute time in my life, that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. That was who we were. That is who we remained for 45 years. Arthur built his reputation as one of London's finest antique clock restorers, a craftsman whose name appeared in the provenance documents of timepieces that eventually found their way to Sotheby's and Christie's. His workshop was in the mews behind our home in Kensington Grove, a 4-bedroom Victorian townhouse that we had purchased in 1991, when the neighborhood still had a butcher's on the corner and a greengrocer who knew your name. He spent his days there, surrounded by the soft ticking and chiming of 100 different centuries, each one a world he had coaxed back to life with his hands. I, meanwhile, built gardens, not just any gardens. I specialized in English heritage gardens, the kind that belonged to country houses and ancient estates, gardens that needed to feel as though they had grown without human intervention, as though the land itself had decided to be beautiful. I worked on gardens attached to National Trust properties. I collaborated with conservation architects. I once spent 8 months designing the restoration of a walled Tudor garden in Kent. And when it was finally finished, when the espaliered fruit trees were trained against the old brick and the knot garden was laid out in its geometric perfection, I cried. Not from relief, from something closer to reverence. I loved what I did. I am not ashamed to say it. I retired at 68, but I never truly stopped. Our own garden in Kensington Grove had become, over the decades, something rather remarkable, a long south-facing town garden that I had designed with the same care I gave to my paying clients. Box hedging, Climbing roses. A small water feature that Arthur had installed for our 30th anniversary, claiming that a garden designer without moving water in her own garden was like a clockmaker without a watch. A summer house at the far end, tucked against the garden wall, painted white with blue shutters and a small veranda, which I had designed myself and which Arthur had helped me build one long summer when we were both pretending to be younger than we were. That summer house, I'll come back to it. Our finances were, I suppose, what one might describe as quietly comfortable. Arthur had been careful with money in the way that people who grew up without very much always are strategic, considered never flashy. Over the decades, he had built a diverse portfolio, UK Treasury bonds that had compounded quietly and reliably for years, a managed trust fund that a financial advisor we'd used since the 1990s oversaw with admirable discretion, and, of course, the collection. His professional tools, rare horological instruments, some of them 18th century, some of them one of a kind, which had their own insurance valuation running to six figures. We were not ostentatious people, but we were not without means. And then there were the pearls. On our 40th anniversary, in 2019, on a golden September evening, Arthur gave me a box. It was a small box, burgundy leather with a gold clasp. The kind of box that had clearly sat on a velvet shelf in a very serious jeweler's for a long time. Inside were the most beautiful things I have ever seen. A set of teardrop South Sea pearls, each one the color of the inside of a shell, each one perfectly matched, strung on a silk cord with a clasp of white gold. They were not modern. They had been owned previously. Arthur had tracked them through an auction house and recognized them as the kind of heirloom that deserved to belong to someone who would understand what they were. "These are for always," he said, which was not poetic or particularly eloquent. It was perfect. I wore them to every significant occasion after that. To our nephew's wedding. To the retirement dinner my colleagues arranged for me. To the lunch at which my last major commission, the restoration of a kitchen garden in Northumberland, won an award from the Garden History Society. I am telling you about the pearls because they matter. They matter enormously. And by the time I get to the end of this part of the story, you will understand exactly why. Arthur's diagnosis came in March of 2022, vascular dementia. The neurologist, a young woman with a quiet voice and the practiced gentleness of someone who delivered difficult news often, explained it to us in terms that were clear and, I think, deliberately unhurried. She wanted us to understand. She wanted us to be able to ask questions. She gave us leaflets. She gave us telephone numbers. I remember sitting in that consulting room with Arthur's hand in mine, and I remember that my main thought, absurd perhaps, but true, was that I needed to get home and write everything down before I forgot any of it. I had carried a leather-bound diary since I was 19 years old. My life was in those pages, appointments, observations, feelings, the small daily record of a woman who believed in the importance of bearing witness to her own existence. I wrote 6 pages that evening. About the diagnosis, about Arthur's face when the doctor spoke, about the drive home, during which neither of us said anything but Arthur kept his hand on my knee the entire way, as though I were the one who needed steadying. The following months were, I will not pretend otherwise, the hardest of my life. Not because Arthur became violent or unkind. He didn't. He remained in essence himself gentle, curious, wry, but the disease did what it does. It arrived in increments. A forgotten word here, a repeated question there. The afternoons when he would stand in the doorway of his workshop and look at his bench, his tools, his clocks, the work of his life, with an expression of polite bewilderment, as though he were visiting someone else's studio and trying to be gracious about not understanding it. I became his primary carer. I did not resent it. I want to say that clearly because some people, when I tell this story, assume that I must have resented it. I didn't. You don't resent caring for someone you love, you grieve, but you don't resent. What I did do in those months was let things slide. I was so focused on Arthur, on his comfort, his routine, his dignity, that I allowed our administrative life to drift. Bills were paid because I dealt with those. But the larger matters, the financial planning, the management of the trust fund, the conversations with solicitors about our last will and testament that we had been meaning to revisit since his diagnosis, those things kept slipping down the list. There was always something more pressing, always a medication to collect, or a GP appointment to arrange, or a night when he woke at 3 o'clock convinced that it was morning, and I would sit with him in the kitchen drinking tea until the sky proved him wrong. I trusted that the documents we had put in place years earlier were sufficient. We had mirror wills. We had spoken to our solicitor, a man called Clive Ashworth, whom we had used since the late 1990s, and he had told us that everything was in order. We had each given the other lasting power of attorney in the event of incapacitation. It was all filed. It was all proper. I did not imagine, even in my darkest moments of those years, that the documents I trusted would be the instruments of my destruction. Arthur died in January of 2024. He died at home in our bedroom on a Thursday morning when the light was coming through the curtains in long, pale stripes. I was holding his hand. His breathing had changed in the night, and the palliative nurse who came at dawn told me gently that it would not be long. She was right. He went quietly, which was entirely in keeping with who he was. I sat with him for an hour afterward. I told him things I had never managed to say aloud in 45 years, not because I hadn't felt them, but because when you have been with someone that long, some things simply exist between you as a kind of understood air, unspoken but entirely present. I told him I was glad he had come to look at that sundial in 1977. I told him I had never once, not for a single day, taken for granted the fact of him. I told him that I was going to be all right. I believed it when I said it. Grief is exhausting in a way that no one who hasn't experienced it can entirely anticipate. In the weeks after Arthur died, I moved through the administrative machinery of death, the death certificate, the coroner's release, the funeral arrangements, on a kind of autopilot that I now recognize as the body's merciful response to the unbearable. I could make phone calls. I could sign documents. I could accept condolences from Arthur's professional colleagues and our small circle of friends with appropriate composure. What I could not do was feel it. Not yet, that would come later. The funeral was a quiet affair. Arthur had specified years before that he wanted no fuss. 30 people perhaps in the same Kensington church where we had been married. His tools polished and arranged on a cloth-covered table in the entrance at the request of his former apprentice who thought it was fitting. I agreed. It was fitting. I came home afterward and sat in his workshop for a long time. The clocks were still. I hadn't wound any of them since his condition had made it unsafe for him to manage it himself, and I hadn't had the heart to do it for him. The silence in that room was immense. Every clock in the world had stopped. The letters from the solicitors began arriving in February. That is when I first felt the shape of something wrong. The first letter was from Clive Ashworth's firm, Ashworth and Partners, Holborn, informing me that they had been contacted by a third party regarding the London probate process for Arthur's estate. The language was measured and professional, but the content made me sit down heavily in my kitchen chair and read the paragraph 3 times. A third party was contesting Arthur's will. I telephoned Clive the same afternoon. Who? I said, before he had finished his greeting. Who was contesting it? There was a pause on the line, the particular kind of pause that solicitors deploy when they are assembling words carefully. A woman named Elena Vasquez, he said. She is claiming to be Arthur's daughter from a prior relationship. I did not speak for a moment. That's not possible, I said. Arthur was not in any prior relationship. We met when he was 25. I knew him. I knew everything about him. I understand, Clive said. Nevertheless, she has produced documentation. What documentation? Another pause. A recently executed will. Electronic format. Dated November of 2023. November 2023. Arthur had been deep in the progression of his disease by November 2023. He had been under the supervision of his GP and his neurologist. He had, I knew this with absolute certainty, no capacity to execute a legal document of any kind. And yet apparently someone was claiming that he had. This document, I said carefully, is it registered? Has it been through London probate? It has been submitted, Clive said. That is why I need to speak with you at length. There is a great deal to discuss regarding your position, the existing last will and testament as I hold it, and the question of the power of attorney, Clive. My voice was very steady. I remember being surprised by how steady it was. Is someone attempting to steal my husband's estate? The pause this time was the longest yet. I think, he said carefully, that we should speak in person. I met with Clive Ashworth at his offices 3 days later. It was a Thursday, the same day of the week that Arthur had died. I noted, which was the sort of detail that imprints itself on your consciousness during periods of acute distress. Clive's offices were exactly as they had always been. Tall windows, oak paneling, the mild institutional smell of a place where important and often unhappy things happen. He was a man in his mid-60s, silver-haired, with the careful manner of someone who had spent decades navigating other people's worst moments without becoming callous. He placed a folder on the desk between us. "I want you to understand," he said, "that the document I am about to show you has not been authenticated. The London probate process for your husband's estate is in its earliest stages, and this submission raises significant questions that we will be pursuing with considerable vigor." "Show me," I said. He slid a printed copy across the desk. It was a will, titled, formatted with Arthur's name at the top. Dated the 15th of November, 2023. It bequeathed the entirety of Arthur's estate, the Kensington Grove property, the trust fund, the treasury bond portfolio, the tool collection, all of it, to Alina Vasquez, described in the document as my daughter, of whose existence I was unaware until recently. My daughter. I felt my heart drop through the floor. I have to stop here and explain something to you. Something that I have told almost no one in my life, because it belongs to a place inside me that is very quiet and very sacred. Arthur and I had a daughter. We fell pregnant in 1983. It was entirely unplanned and entirely, immediately, the most wanted thing that had ever happened to either of us. We were 30 years old. We had been married 4 years. We had talked about children in the abstract way that busy professional people do, circling the subject, never quite landing. But when it happened, we landed immediately. We were overjoyed. Our daughter was born in the autumn of 1983, 6 weeks early, with hair as dark as Arthur's and lungs that sounded, in those first terrible seconds of silence, entirely still. She lived for 4 days. We named her Catherine. I cannot even now, even after all these years, write or speak that name without feeling its full weight. I learned in those 4 days what love is at its most absolute. The kind of love that has no conditions and no expectations and no beginning you can point to, because it simply is, as present and inevitable as gravity. We buried her in a small ceremony in Richmond, near the house where I had grown up. And we came home, and we closed around our grief together. And we never entirely opened again in the same way. Arthur and I were never the same after Catherine. We were perhaps better, more tender with each other, more deliberate in our gratitude, less careless with time. But different, always different. The idea of Arthur having another daughter, a secret daughter, a living daughter hidden away somewhere while Catherine lay in her small grave in Richmond, was not merely improbable. It was an obscenity. I looked at that document and I felt something move in my chest that I can only describe as a kind of cold ignition. A fire that does not warm. "Tell me about this woman," I said to Clive. Her name was Alina Vasquez. She was 34 years old. She claimed to have been born in Madrid in 1990 to a Spanish woman called Cristina Vasquez, who had, according to Alina's submitted statement, had a brief relationship with Arthur Sterling during a business trip to Europe in 1989. 1989. I tried to account for 1989 in my memory. Arthur had made 2 professional trips to Europe in the late 1980s, horological conferences, visits to Swiss and German clockmakers whose techniques he admired. He had gone to Zurich. He had gone to Munich. Had he gone to Madrid? I could not remember. This was, in itself, not unusual. We had not been one of those couples who monitored each other's movements with anxious precision. We trusted each other. We had always trusted each other. But now, sitting in Clive Ashworth's office with a fraudulent will on the desk between us, I was performing the exhausting, demeaning mental exercise of trying to locate a lie inside 45 years of love. Alina claimed to have discovered Arthur's identity through an online genealogy service. She claimed to have reached out to him via email in early 2023, when he was already deep in the grip of his illness, and to have established a correspondence that had led, by that November, to his executing a new will in her favor, via an online legal platform, witnessed apparently by video call. A video call, I repeated when Clive explained this. Arthur in November of 2023 participated in a notarized video call to execute a new will. Arthur, who by that point could not reliably recall what year it was. "That is precisely the argument we will be making," Clive said. "Who notarized it? A firm I am not familiar with. We are investigating their credentials. And the signature, does it look like his signature?" Clive opened the folder to the signature page. I looked at it for a long time. It did look like Arthur's signature. Or rather, it looked like a careful approximation of it. Close enough that someone who had only ever seen it once or twice might not notice the difference. But I had seen Arthur's signature 10,000 times. I knew the particular way he looped the S in sterling, slightly irregular, as though the pen had hesitated, and the small habitual full stop he placed after his name. A quirk I had always found endearing. The full stop was not there. It was almost there. A very faint mark that could have been a smudge, but it was not his full stop, not quite. "Clive," I said, "this signature is a forgery." "We believe so," he said. "We are engaging a forensic document examiner." I sat back in my chair. Outside the tall windows, London continued its November business: taxis, pigeons, the distant scaffolding of the city repairing itself. Normal, utterly normal. And in here, in this oak-paneled room, someone was trying to steal my life. "What happens now?" I asked. "With the estate?" Clive folded his hands on the desk. "Until the probate dispute is resolved, the estate is effectively frozen. No assets can be distributed. But I must be honest with you, Margaret, this process can be lengthy. And in the meantime what?" He paused. "This woman, Alina, she has made a formal application. And there are aspects of the situation that concern me beyond the will itself. It appears she has made some preliminary claims in relation to the Kensington Grove property." I stared at him. "She is claiming an interest in the house? Her solicitors have written to us, yes." The room seemed very slightly to rearrange itself, the way a room does when the ground beneath it is shifted. "On what basis?" I said. My voice was entirely calm. I have always been good at calm. "On the basis that the property forms part of an estate that, according to the new document, was left entirely to her." I stood up. I thanked Clive for his time. I told him I would be in touch the following morning. I collected my coat and my bag and my leather diary, and I walked out through the doors of Ashworth and Partners into the grey London afternoon, and I walked home. I walked all the way home, 45 minutes, through streets I had known for decades, because I needed to feel the ground under my feet. I needed to feel solid things. I want to pause the story here, and I'm sharing what I'm about to share because I don't want what happened to Arthur and me to happen to you. If you have ever felt that a family member was hiding something, hiding finances, hiding documents, hiding a relationship that doesn't quite make sense, please tell me your story in the comments. I read every single one, and what you share might save someone else. This part of my story has a detail in it that I have not spoken aloud since it happened. Because I have not been able to, not without a composure I don't entirely trust. It happened 3 weeks after my meeting with Clive Ashworth. The probate proceedings were underway. Clive's office was engaged with the forensic examination of Arthur's supposed signature. I had provided the court with a sworn statement detailing Arthur's medical condition in November 2023, his neurologist's records, his GP's assessments, the formal documentation of his cognitive decline. I was fighting. I want you to understand that. I was fighting on every front available to me. But the law moves slowly, and grief moves at its own speed, and the body eventually demands what the mind has been denying. I had been going to the garden. Every morning, for as long as the light allowed, I had been going out into my garden in Kensington Grove and doing what I have always done when the world becomes too much. I had been working the soil, cutting back the late roses, lifting and dividing the perennials that had grown too large for their places, raking the gravel path that ran between the box hedges. Gardeners know that there is a particular quality of attention required by a garden, specific, focused, immediate, that is, by its nature, incompatible with catastrophic thinking. When you are trying to determine whether a rose has black spot or whether the soil is too acidic, you cannot simultaneously be consumed by dread. The garden insists on the present tense. I had designed that garden over 30 years. Every plan in it was a decision I had made, a relationship I had cultivated, a small act of faith that the future existed and would be worth making beautiful for. The summer house at the far end, my summer house, the one Arthur and I had built together, I had chosen every detail of it. The white paint, the blue shutters, the way the wisteria I had trained above its doorway would, by May, hang in fat purple clusters and make the whole end of the garden smell like the south of France. On the morning I am about to describe to you, I came out of the back door with my pruning gloves on and my basket over my arm. It was a Wednesday. The light was that particular thin gold of an English winter morning, weak but genuine, the kind of light that makes everything look slightly luminous. I turned toward the front of the house to collect the post before I went down to the garden. And I stopped. In the small front garden, in the bed that I had replanted in 2018 with a combination of Salvia nemorosa and Allium purple sensation, and which flowered in a great sweep of purple every June, there was a sign. A post had been driven into the ground, and on the post was a sign that said sold. I stood on my front step and I looked at it for a very long time. I did not understand what I was seeing. My mind, the careful, organized, professional mind of a woman who had spent 40 years making sense of complex environments, simply could not process it. A sold sign, in my garden, in the bed I had planted. In the bed I had been planning to reseed in February because the allium bulbs were finally due for lifting. I walked to the sign. I touched it. I looked for a name, an estate agent's name, a reference number. Anything that would help me understand. There was a name, a firm I didn't recognize. I went inside and I telephoned the number. A young man answered with the breezy confidence of someone who has not yet experienced anything that has truly frightened him. He confirmed, apologetically, stutteringly, once I made clear who I was, that the Kensington Grove property had been listed by a party claiming to hold authority over the estate under the disputed will, that an offer had been accepted, subject to the resolution of the probate proceedings, that they had, he admitted, not been informed of the full legal complexity of the situation when they took the instruction. Someone had listed my home for sale. Someone had accepted an offer. Someone had driven a sold sign into my salvia bed, while I was still living in the house, while my husband's body was barely cold. I stood in my kitchen, Arthur's kitchen, the kitchen where we had eaten 30 years of breakfasts, where Catherine's small photograph sat on the windowsill above the sink in its silver frame, and I did something that I am not in the habit of doing. I cried. Not delicately, not composedly. I cried the way you cry when the floor has gone and there is nothing under you, messily, furiously, with the full weight of everything I had refused to feel pressing down on me all at once. And then I stopped. I dried my eyes. I straightened my back. I picked up the telephone again and called Clive Ashworth. And then, because I have always been my father's daughter, and my father's first principle was that you never let the ground beat you, I put my pruning gloves back on and I went out into my garden and I got on with it. That was in March. By late April, the legal proceedings had grown more complex and more expensive than I had anticipated. Clive Ashworth was doing everything right, but the court timelines were what they were. The London probate process is not a rapid mechanism, and the disputed will had introduced complications that required expert testimony and documentary evidence, and an amount of correspondence between legal teams that I could almost feel mounting up in billable hours every time my phone rang. The estate was frozen. The house was frozen. I was living inside it, but I was living inside a contested thing, a home that was simultaneously mine and not mine, occupied and disputed, certain and utterly uncertain. Arthur's trust fund, which should have provided me with living expenses during this period, which would have provided me under the original last will and testament, was inaccessible pending probate resolution. I was drawing on my own savings, my own limited, retirement-grade savings. I kept my diary. I kept my garden. I kept my composure mostly. Elena Vasquez had still not spoken to me directly. I had seen a photograph of her submitted as part of her legal documentation, and I had looked at it for a long time. She was dark-haired and angular, with a quality of careful presentation that told me she was used to being observed. She did not look like Arthur. She did not look like anyone I could connect to anyone I had ever known. I had tried once through Clive's office to request a DNA test. Her solicitors had opposed it, citing privacy concerns. The courts had not yet ruled on whether it could be compelled. Privacy concerns, while she was trying to take my home. And then came the morning of May the 2nd. I woke at 6, as I always do. I dressed. I made tea. I went out through the back door to check on the wisteria, which was just beginning to open its first pale flowers above the summer house door, early this year because we'd had an unusual warmth in April. I came back in. I sat at the kitchen table with my diary and my tea and wrote my morning notes as I have done every day since I was 19 years old. And then at 8:30, I gathered my bag and my keys to go to a meeting at Clive's office about the next stage of the proceedings. I put my key in the front door. I turned it. The lock did not yield. I stood on my front step in the May morning, in the light that was gentle and gold and entirely indifferent. With my key in my hand, I tried again and again. Then I stood back and looked at my lock. And I saw it immediately, what I had not seen in the moment because I had not been looking. It was new. The lock was new. The brass was bright where my old lock had been dull with years of use. Someone had changed my lock. In the night, while I slept, someone had come to my house, the house I had lived in for 31 years, and changed the lock while I was sleeping inside it. I remember the feeling of the air going out of my lungs. I remember the sound of the morning around me, a blackbird somewhere in the silver birch, the distant noise of Kensington traffic, someone's shoes on the pavement, all of it continuing entirely without reference to what was happening to me. I called Clive Ashworth from the front step. I called the police. Both processes were, for different reasons, deeply, exhaustingly inadequate to the situation. The locksmith that Clive arranged took 3 hours to arrive. The police explained, with the careful patience of people who encounter the limits of their own jurisdiction frequently, that this was a civil matter, not a criminal one, until such time as a court had ruled on ownership of the property. A civil matter. I was locked out of my own home in the civil manner. I sat on my front step for an hour and a half, in the May sunshine waiting for the locksmith, with my leather diary on my knee. I wrote in it. I wrote everything that was happening with the deliberate, methodical attention of someone who knows that the record is the only weapon she has. I wrote the date. I wrote the time. I wrote every detail I could observe about the new lock, about the morning, about the nature of what was being done to me. I have always trusted people on their word. I have always believed in the fundamental decency of the world that Arthur and I had been so careful to inhabit. I am 72 years old and I have kept a diary for 53 years, and I have never, in all those years, needed it quite so urgently as I did on that front step. When the locksmith came and let me back inside, I stood in my own hallway for a long time. The house smelled of beeswax and old books and the cold ghost of Arthur's cologne, the same cedar and sandalwood he had worn for 20 years, which still sometimes moved through the rooms like a presence. I stood there, and I breathed it in, and I made myself a promise. I was not going to lose this. It was a week later that my friend Dorothy, who had known Arthur and me since the early 1990s, who had been at our kitchen table for more dinners than I could count, telephoned me. Dorothy was not given to drama. She was a practical, measured woman who had been a district nurse for 30 years and who approached most situations with the focused calm of someone accustomed to arriving at crises after they had already peaked. Which was why, when her voice came down the telephone and I heard something in it that was not quite calm, I paid attention. "Margaret," she said, "I need to tell you something." "Tell me," I said. "I've just walked past the bottom of your street. There is a car parked at the end of your garden lane, the lane that runs behind the mews by the garden wall." "Yes, and there is someone in your summer house." The summer house. The summer house that Arthur and I had built together, in the summer when we were pretending to be young. That I had designed myself, the dimensions, the windows, the veranda, the door. The summer house where Arthur had sometimes sat in the afternoons in his last good years, watching the garden, watching the light change on the wisteria and the roses. Someone was in it. I put down the telephone. I did not stop to think. I went through the back door and down the garden path and through the gate in the wall, and I walked around to the garden lane and came at the summer house from the far side. The door was open. I stood in the entrance of my summer house, the one I designed, the one Arthur helped me build, and I looked at the woman inside it. She was standing at the far wall, looking out through the small window toward the garden. She was dark-haired, angular, with the careful presentation I had recognized from her photograph. Elena Vasquez, in my summer house. She turned when she heard me. She did not look surprised. She looked, if anything, as though she had been expecting me, as though she had on some level arranged this. There was a composure about her that I recognized as deliberate. The composure of a person who has rehearsed the moment. She was wearing a navy dress. And around her throat, catching the afternoon light that came through my summer house window, each bead luminous, perfect, devastating, were my pearls. My teardrop South Sea pearls. The ones Arthur had given me on our 40th anniversary. The ones he had said were for always. The ones that had been locked in the small safe in our bedroom, the safe that she, with whatever rights she was fraudulently claiming, must have accessed. My pearls, around her throat. I looked at her. She looked at me. And in the silence of that summer house, the place I had built, in the garden I had designed, in the home that was mine and Arthur's and Catherine's, in the only way any of it had ever mattered, I understood something. This was not a woman who had found a father she hadn't known. This was not a desperate young person reaching for connection across grief and genetics. This was something organized, something planned, something that went back further than Arthur's illness, further than the fraudulent will, further than anything I had yet been able to see clearly. I looked at the pearls around her neck and I felt my heart drop, not with grief this time, with something colder and harder and more specific than grief. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just about a will, this was a murder. I have to stop there for today, not because the story is over, it is very far from over, but because what comes next, what I discovered in the 72 hours after that moment in the summer house, is something I need you to be ready for. Something that I, Margaret Sterling, 72 years old, with 53 years of diaries and 45 years of marriage, and a lifetime of believing in people's fundamental honesty, was not ready for. I'm going to tell you about the investigator I hired, a young woman named Priya, who within 48 hours of looking at Alina's paperwork said 4 words to me that made the floor disappear beneath my feet all over again. This will doesn't exist. Not the will is fraudulent, not the signature is forged. She meant something far more specific and far more terrifying than that. She meant that the document itself, the notarization, the witness, the video call in which my dying husband supposedly signed away everything we had built, had been constructed from nothing. Fabricated using technology that, until that conversation with Priya, I had never heard of. A deep fake. Someone had used artificial intelligence to put Arthur's face, Arthur's voice, Arthur's deteriorating, trusting, gone mind, into a video call that never happened. It made him sign a will he never saw. It made him speak words he never said. And there is something else. Something I found quite by accident, quite by the particular persistence of a woman who has kept a diary every day for 53 years, and therefore notices always when the record doesn't match the memory. I found a photograph. It was in a box of papers I was sorting the week after my meeting with Priya. Old photographs from Christmas parties, from family gatherings over the decades. And in one of those photographs, taken at a Christmas gathering I had not been invited to a decade ago, I saw 2 people standing together, smiling at the camera as though they had known each other for years. One of them was Alina Vasquez. The other was someone I had trusted my entire adult life. Someone whose name, even now, I can barely bring myself to say. Tomorrow. Tomorrow I will tell you everything. Come back at the same time, and I mean that precisely because in part 2, everything you think you know about this story will be turned inside out. The fraud goes deeper than a forged will. The betrayal goes closer to home than anything I have described to you today. And the technology they used, the way they constructed an invisible version of my husband and puppeted him like a ghost, is something that could be happening to someone you love right now, today, in 2024, and you would not know it until it was too late. If this story matters to you, if you believe that a woman of 72 deserves to fight back and win, and that justice is not only for the young and the loud and the digitally fluent, then please do these 3 things before you close this video. Hit the hype button right now. It costs you nothing and it tells this platform that Margaret Sterling's story deserves to be heard by every woman who might be in danger. Subscribe and tap the bell, because part 2 goes live tomorrow at this exact time and I need you there. I need you to hear what they did. And I need you to hear what I did about it. And leave me a comment. Tell me, has someone in your life made you feel like you were disappearing? Like the documents, the accounts, the history of who you are was being quietly rewritten around you while you stood there trusting the way I trusted? Tell me. I read every word. My name is Margaret Sterling. I was not born to be erased, and I am just getting started.